Okay. Um, I'm trying to decide if I'm actually streaming. I think that I am. I've got one thing that's showing not. I've got another thing that's showing I am. So I'm going to go with I am. Go with the positive. Good evening. Welcome to another midweek study. Off to a shaky start. Um, on this episode, this is episode 7 of our midweek study series. And we are or have been exploring some election sermons from American history or colonial history as well. And so we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Let me first just say that I hope the stream is working well, because I've got one control thing telling me that it's not, and another one that seems to be functioning properly. So anyway, the point is, midweek study is a live stream brought to you by Bradford Christian College. Bradford Christian College, an online college providing a number of bachelor degrees and also a Master of Arts in Theological Studies. Um, a link to the script is in the description below, a link to their website. You can find more information there. I'd encourage you to contact Bradford Christian College, um, get more information, see if it's not a choice for you or someone you know to choose Bradford Christian College for your continuing education. So again, I encourage you to check out Bradford Christian College. Okay, so midweek study is my selfish live stream where I'm just working through my stack of stuff, and apparently I'm kind of working through my stack of stuff randomly, maybe. We looked at one election sermon titled Christianity and National Law, and that election sermon in the 1800s, as I recall, was really quite assertive in its position that the United States government is to administer Christianity. That was the conclusion in that election sermon. Now, what we're doing, what we've gotten into, is we're looking at two election sermons. We will be looking at two. Right now, we're just looking at one of them. Um, and we have a 1756 election sermon, which is colonial. And this is uh, this is right at the start of the French and Indian War, all right, the war between Britain and France, and it spills over to the colonies. And so this pastor is preaching an election sermon because there have been those who have been elected to local office, if you will, and he's charged with admonishing and instructing them in their responsibilities as rulers. So that's 1756. And then the same minister has the privilege of preaching an election sermon in 1780, 24 years later. And this will be at the time of the colonies now being free and independent states. And so I thought it'd be interesting to compare the sermons and see similarities, see differences, because both of them are going to be addressing political or governmental ideas, but both rooted in scripture. And I'm going to suggest both reflecting the ideas of their times, the way that colonists and then Americans, if you will, were thinking about government and such. So we're about 5 pages into our our um, sermon here. There we go. So we're about 5 pages into our sermon here, and the main thing that our pastor has been focused on is Moses and the characteristics that we see in Moses. In fact, if we go back here to the beginning of the um, sermon, election sermon, Hebrews 11 and verses 24 through 26, about Moses, who ultimately esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. Okay, and so the authors talked about, and we've read mostly, what the text leads us to consider in the first place. And that's the public spirit of Moses. And we read about that, and I'm not going to go through it again. You've got go to the Bradford Christian College YouTube channel, click on playlist. You'll see the playlist for the midweek study, and you'll be able to find the previous live streams as we read through the first part of this particular election sermon. Okay, so let's see, let's get down to where we ended last time. Yeah, maybe here we'll start with this paragraph. How happy were the Israelites in so wise and tender a leader as Moses, and how happy the people who are governed by men of the same disinterested and public spirit, who consider the community over which they preside as their own family, who watch over it with a paternal care, who strenuously exert themselves for its welfare and take pleasure in doing so, who desire no more power than is necessary for the good of the people, who zealously employ all which they possess for this noble purpose, and can relish that happiness as their own, which they communicate to others. This is the spirit with which every magistrate ought to enter upon his office, which will animate him to the duties and sweeten the cares and fatigues of it. And this every man professes who accepts a place of authority. So he's talking about those qualities that are identifiable in Moses that should be present in those that he's addressing, and maybe always, who are going to take public office. Okay, so let's look at this paragraph. I think I'm repeating paragraphs that we read previously. I know philosophers have disputed much about the motives of human actions, and some have endeavored to prove that all our passions and modes of self-love, that all our passions are modes of self-love. But perhaps the controversy is rather about words than things. It is plain that some men are little affected with anything but what relates to their own interest, and vainly attempt to establish a private and solitary happiness. Others possess the social affections in a due degree and find a wonderful pleasure in doing good. The former are called selfish. Okay, so the former would be those who vainly attempt to establish a private and solitary happiness. The latter, disinterested. That's interesting. Disinterested. Find those who find a wonderful pleasure in doing good. Disinterested and benevolent. I think what they mean by disinterested is they're not taken up with party interests, right? But they're being benevolent. They're somewhat universal in their doing of good. Both these sorts of persons, it is allowed, follow their own taste, but as their tastes are very different, so are their characters. The one is hated and despised. That would be those who are selfish. The other loved and admired. That would be those who are benevolent. These are sentiments founded in nature, in which all nations and ages have generally agreed, and which the refinements of a few speculative men can never subvert. But whatever may be advanced in the school of philosophy, okay, now just realize he's gone through a paragraph there where he's captured the ideas of philosophers, the wisdom of men, you might say. And there's some wisdom there, right? But let's see where he goes with this. Whatever may be advanced in the school of philosophy, disinterested love is, without all doubt, strongly asserted and recommended in the sacred writings. Our divine Redeemer gave us a most affecting example of it in his own incarnation and sufferings, and has commanded us to love one another even as he loved us. Whoever is born of God and possesses the Spirit of Jesus Christ knows the force and sweetness of this divine principle and is taught to love his neighbor as himself. Okay, so let's not just read this and think, well, those are good words or kind words or helpful words, right? Um, Put it in the context, okay? What's happening here? You have a minister who's instructing elected leaders in what qualities they need to properly fill that office. And he's saying you have to go beyond the philosophy of men. You have to dig into what it is that we learned from our divine Redeemer. Okay. In other words, you can't just be a man and fill this office. You need to be a Christian and fill this office. All right, so that was the first place, all that we've read leading up to what we should consider in the first place. From the text, Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. This leads us to consider in the second place the principle of piety, which cherished and supported the public spirit of Moses, and cooperating with it carried him through such a shining course of self-denial and public service. By faith, he, Moses, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Okay, now just note that and he's quoting from the text here. What Scripture equates as the pleasures of sin for a season, what it equates with that in the circumstance of Moses is life in Pharaoh's court. That's the pleasures of sin for a season. Now, this is what fascinates me about the Hebrews 11 verse, that Moses in his day esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. Right? Well, Christ hadn't come yet, right? The mediator was always at work, right? Uh, our Savior, our mediator, was always at work, right there at the garden. He was at work mediating between fallen Adam and Eve and God the Father. Okay. Now, note what our author writes here. The providence of God so ordered it that the education of Moses was for some time committed to his own mother, who nursed him as the adoptive son of Pharaoh's daughter. Both his parents are celebrated by the divine author of this epistle to the Hebrews for their faith. From this principle, they hid their infant son 3 months, not regarding the cruel commandment of the king, which had destined all the male children of the Hebrews to immediate destruction. Right? I think in the book of Exodus, the command is given that they will be thrown into the Nile. Now, you'd have to say technically, mom and dad here obeyed. They did, I don't know if they literally threw, but in essence, they threw Moses into the Nile. Now they arranged it so that he would float in the Nile, right? I just can't. Well, I think that the command that was given by Pharaoh was that as Egyptians came across these children, they were empowered to grab them and throw them into the Nile. Um, the singular beauty of Moses, who is called in the sacred writings divinely fair, and the single interposition of providence for his safety and advancement might naturally lead his parents to hope that this child was designed by heaven for some great and extraordinary purposes, right? So we acknowledge the interposition of providence, but we look at it from the natural, right? Leading his parents to hope that his child was in the design of heaven, or was designed by heaven, right? That Moses was designed for some great and extraordinary purposes. This apprehension, as well as their great piety, could not but engage them to give their son a religious education, to instruct him with peculiar care in the knowledge of the God of Israel, in the promises made by him to the Hebrew nation, and the deliverance which they had been taught to expect. Now, um, it seems to me that for the most part, um, Moses learned what we just read about here when he's committed to his own mother. It seems like the real opportunity to train up Moses in these truths regarding the God of Israel. Now, um, contrary to a popular movie about Moses, it would seem that Moses was not ignorant of his origins. It seems that he was aware of those origins, and this became a point of decision for him. Now, early on, and this is where our pastor goes next, early on, Moses was in conflict, you might say. Such an education was not lost upon Moses, though from his early youth he was surrounded with all the temptations of an idolatrous court. All the learning of Egypt gave him no prejudices against religion. His philosophy never subverted his faith. Oh, that's I'm gonna try here. Okay, what's I'm trying to change the color of my highlighter. I don't know. Okay. Um, his philosophy never subverted his faith. I don't know why. There it goes. His philosophy never subverted his faith, nor did he throw off his piety as an encumbrance while he rounded the circle of the sciences. His faith in the perfections and providence of God and his reliance on the divine promises made to Abraham and his seed animated him to his public services, supported him under all the discouragements with which they were attended. Okay, so, in this second consideration, our pastor is thinking about what things actually empowered or strengthened or upheld Moses to conduct himself the way that he did. And there's his faith, which was not subverted by the philosophies that were being thrown at him. And there is his piety that he held to, even in the midst of sciences that might suggest otherwise. This illustrious patriot endured as seeing him who is invisible, the consideration of an infinitely perfect mind presiding over all events, making the happiness of mankind the object of his care, delighting to execute loving kindness and judgment in the earth, and under whose government only upright and benevolent men may expect to be finally happy. What did it say? Only upright and benevolent men may expect to be finally happy. You know, and then this is well, our pastor is saying that the government that um, comes forth from Moses, because of his faith and his piety, is a government in which the upright and benevolent men are rewarded. Okay, well, um, look, um, no one is upright in and of themselves. Okay, but here, this pastor in 1756 is talking about one of the purposes of government is to so organize things as to um, give people the opportunity to find happiness, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? When, I've tried to take note of the word happy as it shows up through here because I want us to see that this concept of government conducting itself in such a way that people can be happy was really important, right? And not important in a way that we don't really get today because we don't embrace happy as a legal concept. It's not what we do. We think of it as a momentary experience, I suppose, or all right, such considerations as these confirmed the virtue of Moses and made it invincible. His faith, being of the operation of God, was a living, active principle. It assimilated him to the glorious being in whom he believed. It formed him to a divine temper. Okay, now this divine temper, right? We need to understand that it's not temper tantrum, right? Don't think angry. Okay, think tempered steel, or think of a guitar or other stringed instrument being properly tuned. Okay, that's what's meant there. To come, the parts brought into proper tuning with one another. Okay, um, that's what's meant there. It wrought by love and impelled him to the execution of all his great and benevolent designs. The natural affection of Moses to his nation was improved and exalted by faith into a divine virtue. Common humanity and the dictates of nature led him to sympathize with the Hebrews in their sorrows and to exert himself for redressing their wrongs. Religion confirmed the voice of nature, taught him to cherish these benevolent inclinations and reinforce them with some peculiar motives of her own. He had an affection to the Israelites as they were his own brethren, but they were still more dear to him as the people of God. Okay, so that's a pretty interesting. The offspring of that being whom he supremely loved, particularly related to Jehovah, and for whose welfare he had expressed a particular concern. Moses joyfully took part in the reproach of Israel because he esteemed it the reproach of Christ himself. That angel of the covenant from whom Jacob obtained the blessing, who had taken the seed of Jacob under his own conduct and patronage, who was afflicted in all their afflictions, of whose incarnation Moses prophesied, and of whom he was a type. Right, so this is how our pastor is going to explain that portion of the Hebrews 11 passage where it says he's esteeming the approach of Christ. And he's equating esteeming the approach of Christ for Moses as essentially the same thing as choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God. Right? At that point, he's saying that Christ is the Israel of God. Thus, the public spirit of Moses was enlarged and invigorated by a principle of true religion. Okay. So, public spirit enlarged and invigorated by a principle of true religion. In him, the love of God and benevolence to men were happily united. And by the joint force of these principles, he supported his great character and became superior to the mighty temptations with which he was encountered. His faith taught him to extend his prospect far above all present and sensible things to that glorious recompense of reward which God has laid up in another state for upright and good men. Okay, now he's returning to his main passage, right? Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect to the recompense of the reward. Okay, and so what's our pastor saying here? That the recompense, did I lose my place? Yeah, we're here. His faith taught him to extend his prospect far above all present and sensible things, right? Far above the here and now to that glorious recompense of reward. Okay. I would say that's not unlike seek ye first the kingdom of God, right? While this was full in his view, the scepter and wealth of Egypt appeared but small and contemptible things, right? So think about how fascinated um, present day is with things of Egypt, right? And there's been something of a renewed fascination with the things of Egypt as they think they've, uncovered even grander mysteries of the pyramids and what might be underneath the pyramids and what have you. So there's been a lot in the news about Egyptian artifacts, archaeology, and things built by the Egyptians and things we think were built now underground by the Egyptian, right? So a lot of fascination with that. And so we're looking at those things as artifacts, right? Um, not anything like the beauty and glory and grandeur um, in the day of Moses, for example. But because Moses had his religion right, okay, because Moses had his religion right, and his faith flowed out of that, and as the pastor has spoken here, um, he was able to see that all of those seemingly wonderful things from Egypt are small and contemptible. And notice what it says here. He, Moses, could cheerfully resign. He could cheerfully resign what? Right? We hear about people resigning, we just think about, okay, they're stepping down. But the resigning is a trading of one thing for another, right? A job for not a job or what have you. Look at what our pastor says here. A palace for a cottage, royalty for reproach, pleasure for affliction. Okay. Now, just to speculate, right? I don't know that this happened this way. I doubt it did. But just to speculate, right? We come to that day, right? Moses, from all we can understand, next in line to be Pharaoh, next in line to be king of the powerful nation of Egypt. And he walks into Pharaoh's court, and he may not even called him Pharaoh. He may have called him grandfather, right? Hey, granddad. Um, but whatever. And he walks in and he says, I've been thinking about this, and I want to resign my place. And Pharaoh look at him and say, are you crazy, Moses? You have this palace here that is yours. You will never ever want for a beautiful place to live. You'll have all the finest things that are included in this palace. Are you crazy? And Moses would say, well, I want to resign that palace for a cottage. I don't know, a hut, whatever, whatever shepherds in the Midian plains lived in, right? You see, Pharaoh, Moses would say, I want to go live with my people, the people of God. And Pharaoh would say, what? Moses, are you crazy? You're royalty here. You're royalty. You are the next Pharaoh after me. You're royalty. People will adore you. People will worship you. You will be loved wherever you go. Not only will people line up to see you, but people will clear the path for you. Well, Moses says, I want to resign the royalty and I want to live with God's people. And Pharaoh would say, wait a minute, are you talking about the Hebrews, the slaves? Those people are reproach, right? Those people are mocked, they're laughed at, they're nothing. You're going to give up royalty for that? And Moses, don't forget all the pleasure that is here for you to enjoy. Yeah, Pharaoh, Moses says, I want to resign from that. I want to resign from the pleasure that's here. Again, to go be with the people of God. Wait a minute, Moses, do you understand that we've taken their straw away, but they still have to make the same number of bricks? You understand the affliction under which they live? That's what you want? And Moses is saying, yeah, that's what I want. Um, Here's my resignation. I've signed it, you approve it. Is that how it went? I don't know. I doubt it. But as our pastor here says, Moses could make this resignation when he was come to years, being past the folly of childhood and not yet arrived to the insensibility of old age. The far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory which was set before him extinguished the little honors of the world and sweetened all the self denials which God called him to endure for the good of his nation. Now, what our author has hinted at, because he said that Moses is a type of Christ, is when we think about Moses resigning the place in the palace of Egypt, it is a picture to us of the humiliation of Christ, right? When God the Father and God the Son were um, making their agreement that God the Son would come to earth and give up the palace of heaven and come to earth um, to live as a man in order to save man. This was the discussion that was held, right? Now, obviously, heaven is not Egypt. It's much better than Egypt, right? Um, Heaven is not a place where you enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, right? The point is the comparison of living in the luxury of the palace of Egypt as compared to living in the squalor of the children of Israel. That difference, both in kind and distance, is a type of Christ leaving the palace of heaven and the glorious living, the pleasure without sin that he enjoyed there, and coming and living in the squalor of a sick and broken people who don't even have straw to make bricks. And so the question is, who in his right mind would make such a trade? Who would trade a palace for a cottage? Who would trade royalty for reproach? Who would trade pleasure for affliction? Well, A, the most important man in history ever, Jesus. B, an important man in history, Moses. Such is the influence of true piety. So certainly does it greaten the human mind and become the support of genuine virtue. Piety greatens the mind and supports virtue. While it leads us to discharge our duty to God, it gives us a quick sense of our obligations to men and breaks the force of those worldly temptations by which many are unhappily persuaded to violate these obligations. Right? I actually think that that statement right there could have been really helpful in our Tuesday night Lantern's Quest podcast. Think about what this says. While it, piety, leads us to discharge our duty. That's a good thing, to discharge our duty. That means to fulfill our duty to God. It gives us a quick sense of our obligations to men. See, and these aren't bad things. Well, I don't want you to feel obligated. Well, yeah, I do want you to feel obligated. Right? We should all have obligations, right? That we should want to be fulfilling. It should be a natural thing for us to say, well, I'm obligated to do this. I am obligated to. I mean, we're not doing a show of it. My point is not that, we with other people around, we say, now I want you all to understand that I was under obligation to do this, and you need to respect me for that. No, I'm talking about internally what should be happening with us, right? I have an obligation, and unfulfilled obligations should not sit lightly on our shoulders. I know I'm terribly convicting myself as I say that. And um, come on, we can do better. So it gives us a quick sense of our obligations to man. It breaks the force of those worldly temptations by which many are unhappily persuaded to violate these obligations. Huh. That suggests that this piety is pretty important. Now, the word piety, I think, has had an interesting history. I think it's maybe more often thought in a negative sense than a positive sense. Piety, well, you don't just want to be a pious Christian. Maybe you've heard. Um, but in 1756, I would say in 1828, piety was not um, such a negative term. Let me see if I can quickly get to my Webster's 1828. I am pulling up my digital version here. Piety. Piety in principle. Okay, so I don't know what your history is with the word piety or pietism or being pious. You might have a negative connotation of it. Okay, so let me read this first definition of piety, and you tell me. Well, you decide if it's a negative, right? Piety in principle is a compound of veneration or reverence of the Supreme Being and love of his character, or veneration accompanied with love. Now, that's piety in principle. That's like I might even say that's the science of piety. Okay. So it's the first half of his definition. It's a compound of, a mixing of veneration or reverence of the Supreme Being and the love of his character. Then he says, and piety in practice, this you could think this is the art of piety. Piety in doing piety is the exercise of these affections in obedience to God's will and devotion to his service. Hmm. How about you? I don't think I'm seeing any issues there. Like piety, yeah, ask for it by name, accept no substitutes. I was like, that, good grief, if only I could be a percentage of that, a percentage better maybe than what I am, right? We have the science and art of piety right here, the principle, a compound of veneration or reverence of the Supreme Being and love of his character. Well, how do I get that? I just, work it up in me? No, because what's in you is at enmity with God, right? And something that's at enmity with something else does not just start revering and venerating and loving that thing it's an enemy of, right? Something's got to change there, right? That enmity has to be put aside. So, the science of piety is rooted in an actual change in nature that has to take place. And look, I think all that we're left with at that point is to, like the thief on the cross, beg to be remembered, right? Like, please, Lord, regenerate me, right? See to it that I am regenerated, that there is this change in nature. Draw out of that new nature the love of God's character, right? Now, see, um, oh, I just really love Jesus. Okay, good. But to say that you love Jesus' character or God's character is, I would argue, a little bit different. To say I love Jesus is maybe to say I love the idea of Jesus. I love the way that, I love the Jesus that's often presented as meek and mild and always kind. The Jesus that never twists together the whip that he uses to drive out the money chain. We're not talking about that Jesus, right? Not the Jesus who does speak harshly at times towards others. But no, what Webster defines here is that piety is love of the Supreme Being. I mean, that's God. Um, and love of his character, right? In fact, it would seem here that you might come to understand that you revere the being and you love the character. And and I'm making a big deal about this right? Maybe you already know where I'm going with this, but how do we know the character of God? Well, you read the Bible. Yes, you do. And God's character is all over that Bible. Yes. But there are some particular statements that are very telling about God's character, right? Thou shalt not bear false witness. You know who has never borne false witness? In fact, do you know who said that a reason that he came was to bear testimony to the truth, which, if you're going to, right, what's the opposite? If I'm not to bear false witness, what am I to bear, right? The point of the Ten Commandments is not to leave you with nothing to do, right? It's not to say, don't bear false witness. Okay, I just won't bear witness of anything. Like, that's not what the Ten Commandments are about, right? What are you to bear? Well, bear true witness. Be a witness to the truth. You see, and God has always been that. Jesus exemplified that in his life. He declared that as a reason for coming. And then there's the rest of us, right? There's the rest of us. Um, yeah, so loving his characters is, I think, is necessarily different than saying, um, I love God. Right? Because the moment you say, I I love his character, right now you're getting down to the particularities of the God that you claim you love, right? And he's either going to be the true God or he's some false God that makes you feel comfortable. Okay. But look, piety in principle is only half of piety because there's piety in practice. And that's from out of the reverence for God and the love of his character comes what? Obedience, right? Obedience to his will. Well, what's his will? I just don't know the will of God. Well, open the Bible and find out, right? Like, the will. Do I, do I take this job or that job? It may not matter, right? Because what's the will of God regarding jobs? Be a good employee. Do all that you can legally and ethically to make your employer a success. Don't come into a job whining and demanding that you deserve all manner of benefits from somebody who's taking the risk of putting their assets at risk to conduct a business, right? What? Don't do that. Be obedient to God's will. Come into that job and, you know, what can I do to make my employer, make the business owner a success? Can I work some extra hours? Can I even can I even do some extra without demanding some kind of fair compensation, right? The will of God. Okay. And devotion to his service, right? So being devoted, right? Um, the one you are devoted to is the one that you think of first and most often, as in terms of what am I doing? What am I doing? Is that reflective of my devotion to him? All right, I'm going to stop because I'm feeling really convicted at this point that my piety is, I don't know what words we have to be, somewhere on the scale. What's piety? I don't know. All right. So piety, back to our sermon here. Sorry, that was a quite the wandering, right? Piety adorns every station of life, but appears with peculiar advantage in the character of a ruler. Now, don't let's not forget context here, right? Our pastor isn't just rambling on about there's this really cool guy in history, Moses, and he can teach us a lot, right? He's very pointed in his purpose, right? It's hey, you guys that have been elected to office here, piety. You want to be a good politician? Piety. You want to accomplish much for the good of the community? Piety. You want to be able to think clearly about the policies and the bills and such that come before you and be able to massage and modify them to make them better, to eliminate those portions that are not right, to know whether to vote up or down. Piety. Piety adorns every station of life, but appears with peculiar advantage in the character of a ruler. It teaches him the right use of power. Well, that's interesting. Right. So it doesn't teach just the use of power. It doesn't, it's not just like, hey, my piety is telling me that I got power to use, and right. We're talking about the right use of power. I would say that's, as opposed to the wrong use. Okay, I don't know what's happening here. I shouldn't have updated my machine today because it's not. And gives a happy, here's that word again, a happy direction to the whole of his public conduct. A a pious ruler consecrates all his talents to the honor of God and the good of mankind. Right? So you can imagine that there would be those elected officials, some at least, who would say, well, Pastor, I'm not really sure what it means to be a pious ruler. I mean, what a pious ruler, what does that mean? Well, the talent you have for administration, right, for being a politician, consecrate that to the honor of God. I mean, wouldn't it just, I don't know if it would change things or not, frankly. It's all in God's hands, right? It certainly would be a different country, or at least a different state, right? If in a state, every year when the new session begins, the first thing that happens is, okay, elected officials, we're going to take a moment here and we're going to consecrate our talents to the honor of God and the good of mankind. I mean, if they turned that into a solemn ceremony, and I mean, I'm not saying that ceremonies themselves are, can accomplish these things, and yet, you know, marriage is considered a solemn ceremony, right? And we want to, I guess, right? We want to keep it a solemn ceremony to maintain the seriousness of that bond and the I think part of at least part of an intention is that the solemnity of that ceremony would help to ensure the preservation and continuation of that marriage, right? I don't know. Could you imagine that you put together some kind of swearing in that includes I state your name here, consecrate all my talents to the honor of God and the good of mankind. Now, obviously, people can just ramble through oaths and such and not even give it a second thought. Obviously, I still think it'd be interesting if that was a thing, right? If the rest of the country say, "Have you heard about that state over there? You know what they're doing?" People get elected to office, and in their swearing in, they're consecrating their talents to the honor of God. Like, what is that about? I don't know. Maybe you should look into it. He, the pious ruler, still, right? We're still talking about the pious ruler here. He makes the perfect rectitude of the divine administration the rule and model of his own. Okay, now this word right here, rectitude, um, we might be concerned. What is that talking about? Right? Like, what rectitude? What is that? Okay. Now I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to go look at Webster's 1828. We're going to see how close I am. But I think the word rectitude, you can think of a plumb line, right? And I think they still use plumb lines today. Maybe it's all laser done now. I don't know. But the idea of the plumb line was to make sure that um, things were square, straight, proper, right? Okay, let's see how I did. We're going to Webster's 1828. This is um, like a little game show here. Does he win the prize? Whatever the prize. Rectitude. In morality, I don't know I don't even know if my example is going to show up in here. I thought it did in Webster's, but in morality, rightness of principle or practice, uprightness of mind, exact. Okay, this is the phrase that will mean the most to us. I think. Exact conformity to truth or to the rules prescribed for moral conduct. Okay, let's see if he. I don't know that he talks about the plumb line. All right, so there you go. I just made that up, the plumb line. But I think it's a good look. Rectitude comes from the Latin rectus, right, straight, literally straightness. And what do you do with the plumb line? You make sure that everything's straight. So my example works. But he, a pious ruler, makes the perfect rectitude of the divine administration, the rule and model of his own. Right? Keep that swearing in going. I, state your name here, consecrate all my talents to the honor of God and the good of mankind. I will endeavor to make the perfect rectitude of the divine administration the rule and model of my own administrative work. Let's see, the pious ruler imitates the justice and benevolence of that being. I, I promised to, to the best of my abilities, imitate the justice and benevolence of God. I'm like, there's my mythical state, right? And all the other states like, you know what's going on over there? You know what the judges do in that state every day they open court? They're sworn in and they vow to the best of their ability, imitate the justice and benevolence of God. To whom he pays his first regards. To whom? That being God. And in such a conduct, whatever self-denial it may cost him, he will certainly at last find his own interest. And so we come to consider, and okay, so um, all right, I need to find something here. Right, because I take the bulk of that paragraph right there to to essentially serve as an oath of office. Like, yeah. And that kind of last sentence of the paragraph, because at the very end there, and so we come to consider in the third, that's like introducing the next paragraph. Um, in such conduct, whatever self-denial it may cost him. All right, as I read that, um, it made me think of the end of the Declaration. Let me think of two things, actually. Maybe think of the end of the Declaration, where they say, for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That's kind of a whatsoever it may cost them statement, right? Let's see if I can find the other thing that comes to mind. I'm asking the interwebs to help me here. Um, and in such conduct, all the conduct in that paragraph that was expressed, um, whatever self-denial it may cost him, right? It makes me think of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford's history. I've got the quote here. So many, therefore, of these professors as saw the evil of these things in these parts, and whose hearts the Lord had touched with heavenly zeal for his truth, they shook off this yoke of anti-Christian bondage. And as the Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in the fellowship of the gospel, to walk in all his ways made known, or to be made known unto them, according to their best endeavors, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. Now, what I don't have in this quote here is that I think that's immediately followed by Bradford writing, and that it did cost them, this history will tell, or something to that effect. Um, right. This self-denial that costs the pious politician, right? Based on what our pastor has told us, what we need to be thinking of is the cost of Moses, right? His self-denial is an example for us of the pious ruler. The cost of trading a palace for a cottage, a royalty for reproach, pleasure for affliction. You see? But for the pious ruler, that self-denial that costs him is what it means to be a pious ruler. It's like not a question. It's not for the pious ruler, it's not, well, man, I could really do so much with that palace. No. If self-denial demands resigning the palace and accepting the cottage, it's not even a question. The pious ruler does it. Okay. And so we come to consider in the third and last place the wisdom of Moses. Whoops, I didn't mean to scribble. I thought I was highlighting. For some reason, there's like a delay. I don't know. Things that I try to do, they happen later. I don't know why it's being this way. Anyway, the wisdom of Moses. In following the dictates of his conscience and answering his obligations to God and to his brethren, the Hebrews, in opposition to such great worldly motives, whoever resolutely discharges his duty under the greatest discouragements and can generously deny himself for the good of others. There's kind of two words that don't typically go together, right? Why don't you generously deny yourself? Like, what? That doesn't seem like lays the surest foundation for his own happiness. I'm telling you, I'm telling you that word right there. I'm circling it. You may not see anything yet, but it'll show up in a moment here. There it goes. The surest foundation for his own happiness. I'm telling you that word is everywhere. And I'm just saying, it's got to be more significant than what we give it credit for today. I'm just, and will certainly gain in the end much more than he parts with at present. Piety and benevolence are, in a good measure, their own reward. And the consciousness of having done our duty is in itself no small and contemptible pleasure. A self approving mind and the sweet hope of the divine favor are a treasure, which is ill exchanged for anything that the world has to bestow. Right? This hope of the divine favor, right? To have Jesus smile at you for what you've done is much greater treasure than anything that the world has to bestow. Right? That takes us back to Moses and his decision to leave the courts of Egypt. Because according to Hebrews 11, it would seem that Moses had come to the conclusion Christ smiling at me is a far greater treasure than anything Pharaoh has. I mean, look at what Pharaoh has. I mean, look at what Pharaoh has, right? Like, Moses, therefore, showed his prudence, another word for wisdom, in despising the treasures of Egypt, the magnificence of its court, and the luster of its crown, when he could not enjoy these without forfeiting his allegiance to God and becoming the oppressor of his own nation had he renounced his religion for the riches of this world, had he stopped his ears against the cries of his brethren and laid the foundation of his own greatness in their misery, he would, after all, have procured for himself but a wretched kind of happiness. And so even here, we get happiness in the negative, right? The wrong. And yet it's still this concept of striving after happiness, right? A mind capable of so much baseness, perfidy, and cruelty could never have been the feat of self-enjoyment. An accusing conscience and a certain fearful looking for of judgment must have dampened his sprightliest pleasures and destroyed the relish of all that had been so dearly purchased, right? So this paragraph ends with the descriptor of suppose Moses hadn't resigned the luxuries of Egypt for the affliction and persecution and reproach of the people of God. Yeah, he would have purchased something, but it would have been a wretched kind of happiness. It would have been an accusing conscience, a fearful looking for of judgment. Many who value themselves upon their worldly wisdom betray the most egregious folly and grasp a shadow while they lose the substance. Okay. And so clearly at this point, our pastor is looking at his audience and he's saying, I need to warn you about the arrogance of thinking you've gained worldly wisdom. All the pomp of wealth and power, ill-gotten and ill-employed, is but the gay outside of woe. Right now, obviously, this isn't the present use of gay, right? And so recognizing that, that's a really interesting turn of phrase. Okay. I mean, woe is not just being sad. Woe is coming undone. Okay. And so That was a beautiful turn of phrase here. The gay outside of woe, right? Woe dressed up as Webster defines gay, merry, airy, jovial, sportive, right? A splendid covering to a restless mind and to an aching heart. This pomp is indeed too commonly esteemed a mark of happiness, and upon this account, perhaps, it is chiefly valued. Though very imperfect must be that happiness which a man derives from what another imagines, and not from what he himself feels. But if any are desirous of appearing with the greatest advantage in the eyes of their fellow men, if they have a thirst for true glory and can relish that good name which is rather to be chosen than great riches, let them join in, or let them join piety and a public spirit to their titles and authority and employ their abilities in doing good. God often honors, even in this life, those who honor him. So Moses was taken up into the mount with Jehovah. And when he descended to bring the divine constitutions, interesting use of word there, to bring the divine constitutions to the people whom he had delivered, he was encircled with a glory that struck the whole congregation of Israel, a brighter luster than he could have derived from the diadem of Egypt. Think about that. There's another wonderful turn of phrase right there that just takes us back to that. Was it worth it resigning Egypt? And the crown that crowned Moses had much greater luster than whatever crown Egypt came up with. That's pretty interesting. So highly was his character at last revered by the Hebrews that God saw fit to conceal from them the place of his burial. Yeah, I don't know if you know that. It's like apparently it was not known where Moses was buried. Lest their ardent affection to their departed deliverer should rise into idolatry. See how good God is? He protects us from our deep-seated foolishness, right? And they should make the ashes of Moses the object of their adoration. His memory wanted no monument of brass or marble to perpetuate it. It has lived through all ages without such a feeble support. And his name has been mentioned with respect by Gentile authors, as well as gloriously distinguished in the sacred writings. Wow, um, that's wonderful what the pastor is pointing out here, right? Because you think about all the names in history, and there's a ton of them, right? Some stand on a higher pinnacle than others, and clearly Moses is one of the name of Moses is one that's um, highly regarded in terms of historical figures. And yet, how many others? George Washington has his monuments, right? Thomas Jefferson, his monuments. Uh, so many others, at least a burial place. And then there's Moses. As we've gone through this, and you need to, if you haven't done so, you need to view the previous episodes as we've gone through this particular sermon and considered what this pastor has delved into regarding the character of Moses. And he's not just some guy who got angry and struck a rock and missed out on promised land. That's not who he is. This pastor sees in Moses those essential and necessary qualities that he desires to see in those elected in colonial Massachusetts at a particularly dangerous time because the colonies are being dragged into that French and Indian War. And, that's difficult times. We need stable, good, wise rulers in times of war, right? All right. I think that we're going to end there. I don't think we did as well this episode as last. Well, maybe we did. I don't know because I don't know how many times we've visited this sermon now, I guess. But uh, here's the point. We made it into page 8. We're trying to get to page 14. So we still got a ways to go. I think last week I was hopeful that 2 more episodes we could be done. Well, not if I don't govern myself, right? I need to become a pious ruler over our reading here and see to it that we make the progress that we want to make. But there's so much good stuff, right? These sermons aren't like so many modern sermons that are fluff, right? There's so much depth and stuff contained here that it takes time to contemplate and consider. And you don't want to miss the beautiful turns of phrase that these colonial and early American pastors were able to generate. All right, so yeah, uh, this has maybe been the best of what we've looked at so far in this sermon because it was so practically applied to the job of an elected official. It's so zeroed in on what's necessary. And I would even argue it gives to us those ideas, those oaths that could make part of an oath of office for a community, a state, what have you, that was concerned about conducting itself in a way that draws the smile of God. Well, thanks for joining me for this episode of Midweek Study as we continue our trek for now through some election sermons that reveal God's truth as applied to life, in particular to life in politics and government, but also reveal much about the history of this nation that is largely forgotten. I hope you're I hope you're seeing both of those things as we plod through these election sermons. And I hope you'll join me again. The plan is not to meet next week, not to have a midweek study next week, since that'll be Christmas Eve, and then not the next week, since that'll be New Year's Eve. So I think there's going to be a 2-week break here, and then we will return to our midweek study. Dare I say it? Next year, we'll return to our midweek study. So, midweek study may be gone for a couple of weeks, but that doesn't mean it's gone. That means it's doing what hopefully you are doing, enjoying the Christmas season, um, and then having extended time with friends and family as we celebrate into the new year. All right. That's what I've got for you this episode. Please don't forget our other episodes during the week. Coming up for this week, Friday, a random cast. Monday, History Done Right. Tuesday, Lantern's Quest next week. Those will be the only 2 that we have the next 2 weeks. Those will be the only 2 live streams that we'll do for those weeks. Please join us. Please check out bradfordchristiancollege.com. Please here comes the YouTube thing. Hit the like button, um, subscribe. I don't know what all you're supposed to do. Share, drop a comment. I think even dropping comments are helpful. But yeah, do all that. And hope to see you next time in a couple of weeks here when we return to our midweek study.